In this video, we're going to be going over body water content. Water is the most abundant molecule in the human body and accounts for about 60% of our body weight. The normal water content can be described using what's known as the 60-40-20 rule, where 60% of your body weight is water, and 40% of the body weight is intracellular fluid, and 20% of the body weight is extracellular fluid. When you add up the 40% from intracellular fluid and 20% from extracellular fluid, you get 60%, which is of total body weight, which is water. When you categorize these body fluid compartments, generally they divide them into two compartments. You have an intracellular fluid compartment and an extracellular fluid compartment. The intracellular fluid is within cells, as shown here, and accounts for about 2/3 of the total body water volume is within your cells. Extracellular fluid accounts for about 1/3 of the total body water volume and consists of interstitial fluid, and this lies between the cells and your blood plasma, which is the liquid portion or the liquid matrix of the blood. That's your extracellular fluid. Sometimes you'll look at sources and they'll say body fluid compartments are in 3 compartments: intracellular fluid, plasma, and interstitial fluid. So you just have to be aware of how they might be categorizing these, whether it's 2 compartments or they're 3 compartments. It's the same thing. But it's important to note that when we're looking at these body fluids, realize that the water between these compartments can move back and forth. So you're going to have water from the plasma moving into the interstitial fluid, and then from the interstitial fluid into the intracellular fluid. And it can go back the other way, depending on what your hydration level is. Another term you need to be aware of that can be used instead of interstitial fluid is intercellular fluid. INTER means between. So interstitial fluid and intercellular fluid are the same thing. They're between these cells here in the tissues, just like intracellular fluid is within the cells. The 60-40-20 rule is based on a 70 kilogram or 154 pound lean adult male aged 20 to 40 years. Realize that when you're looking at different people, they could have a slight different percents based on sex, age, mass, and body fat percentages. For example, water content of normal adult females is about 50% of body weight. This lower percentage of water than males is because of higher percent adipose tissue. And this can vary between lean adult females versus male that has more adipose tissue. It can vary, but you want to keep this into account. Adipose, or fat tissue, is the least hydrated tissue in the body, only about 15% water. Even bone at 30% water contains more water than fat. And in contrast, when you look at skeletal muscle, this has about 75% water. So the more muscle mass one has, whether you're male or female, the higher the total body water percent will be. Water content of infants is about 70% of the body weight, so they're really hydrated. Water content of elderly, over 60 years old, is 45 to 50% of body weight. And this gives you a chart of body build versus male and female and the different ages. You don't need to know all of these numbers here, just the ones that I gave you in the notes preceding this table. Let's test our knowledge. Body water content part 1. Pause the video and select the term that makes the sentence correct. Here are the answers. Here's part 2. Go ahead and pause the video, select the term that makes the sentence correct. Here are the answers. Now you want to make sure you have these terms, you understand what they mean, because this plays a really important role physiologically and clinically in the movement of this water. Because we're going to see, usually you have a diagram such as this representing extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, where extracellular fluid consists of plasma and interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid is what we find inside the cells. Well, these are separated by membranes, whether we're talking about a blood vessel membrane or we're talking about the cell membrane, and fluid moves in between these 3 compartments. Let's go ahead and test our knowledge. What do we call A and B? A is intracellular fluid, B is extracellular fluid. And you can also refer to this as interstitial fluid if we're talking about the tissues. And if we're talking about the fluid around blood cells, we refer to that as plasma. Go ahead and pause the video and label A, B, C, and D. Here are the answers. Looking at the classification of body fluids, water is distributed in 2 main fluid compartments. that include the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid compartments. Intracellular fluid, ICF, also called cytosol, this is the fluid within cells that makes up about 2/3 of total body water. This 40 liters and 10.6 gallons is just a FYI. You don't need to memorize these numbers here, but you definitely need to know about 2/3 of your total body water is intracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid is the fluid outside of cells and is about 1/3 of your total body water. And this includes our interstitial fluid, also called intercellular fluid. That's the fluid around the cells and the tissues, which is about 75% of your extracellular fluid. The plasma is the extracellular fluid we find in blood vessels, which represents about 25% of extracellular fluid. Lymph. This is the extracellular fluid that we find in lymphatic vessels. It's usually not included in the total calculation. It makes up about 3% along with transcellular fluid, which I'm going to be going over in just a little bit. And lymph comes from the capillary beds. Remember we were talking about the capillary bed, how we have fluid that leaves out of the arterial end of the capillary bed and gets returned to the venal end of the capillary bed? Well, not all the fluid actually returns to the venal end of the capillary bed. A little bit of fluid is going to be taken up by lymph vessels, and that's going to go through the lymphatic system, where you have lymph nodes. And we'll talk a lot about the lymphatic system and the way that lymph moves through it. And then eventually that lymph fluid is going to be put back into the venous system up here around the subclavian veins. Another fluid you want to make sure you star is transcellular fluid. This is extracellular fluid contained in epithelial-lined spaces, such as the cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid that you find here in joints, intraocular fluid in the eye, serous fluid. Remember, this is what's produced by the serous membranes lining these body cavities. So for example, when you look at the serous membrane known as the pleura, this is the pleural space here around the lungs, that produces a fluid. It's called pleura-serous fluid. Around the heart we have serous fluid, pericardial fluid. In and around the abdominal cavity we have fluid, which is called the peritoneal fluid. And these serous fluids help to lubricate the organs as they move. And you also have gastrointestinal secretions. In addition, lymph and transcellular fluid make up about 3% of your extracellular fluid, but are not normally included in your extracellular fluid calculations. Fluid spacing is really important. When we talk about fluid spacing, this is a term used to describe the distribution of body water. We refer to first spacing. This is the normal distribution of fluid in the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid compartments. Second spacing is when you have an abnormal accumulation of interstitial fluid. That's that fluid around the cells and tissues, which we call edema. So here's an example of edema. That would be second spacing. Third spacing is when you have excess fluid accumulation in non-functional area between cells where it's not easily exchanged with the extracellular fluid. Examples of third spacing is ascites. This is where you have the accumulation of fluid within the abdominal cavity. You can see it expanding out here. Pleural effusion. This is where you have fluid buildup in the pleural space here, which is between the lung here and the wall, which can cause the lung not to be able to expand all the way. And edema associated with burns is called third spacing. Note, depending on the source that you're looking at, third spacing can also be used to describe loss of fluid in the interstitial space, such as edema. Usually it's second spacing that they refer to as edema, but I've seen some sources call it third spacing as regular edema. Third spacing can also be used to describe fluid shifts into body cavities, the transcellular space, such as ascites, pleural effusion, as well as burns, which is usually where third spacing is used. It's important to know that with severe burns, fluids may pool in the interstitial space on the burn site and be lost due to blister formation or evaporation due to destruction of the skin. So people who have severe burns, you have to really watch those individuals for dehydration. So let's test our knowledge. Go ahead and pause the video and select the term that makes the sentence correct. Here are the answers. Pause the video, select the term that makes a sentence correct. Here are the answers. And that concludes the video. Let me know if you have any questions.